Quando posso? Bakis, quando si può? Quando iniziamo? No, no, solo per saperlo, non volevo fare fretta, ma solo...
Quando tutti sono pronti, non so, magari se dà un messaggio...
Bakis, dai tu il via. Prendete posto, per favore. Tutto bene. Sì, infatti non si sa. Sedetevi che iniziamo. Sta guidando. Sta guidando. Ho detto che secondo lui sarà qua verso le 8:30. Io ho detto non correre. Infatti non ha detto ma vado piano. È partito oramai 3/4 d'ora fa più o meno. Sì. Chi è che dà il via? Francesco, si può? Ah, si è pure registrato questo. Ottimo. In diretta questo. Non me lo potevi dire, no? Grazie. Meno male che ho detto solo questo. Allora, io non vedo Rebecca e Daniel, no, perché non hanno acceso la telecamera. Ok. Allora, buonasera a tutti, good evening to everybody. This is the pre-opening, as you know, a sort of preview of our Congress, the Congress of Italian Society of Cultural Anthropology, Società Italiana di Antropologia Culturale, Siac in Italian. On behalf of Professor Ferdinando Mirizzi, our president, who is very sorry not to be here, but he's driving towards Rome in this moment. As vice president of Siac, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you, but above all, Rebecca Bryant and Daniel Knight, who have accepted to give us this opening lecture. As everybody knows, they are the authors of a very interesting, quite recent book, The Anthropology of the Future, so nothing more consonant with the theme of our third Congress, Anthropologists of the Future of Anthropology. So thank you, Rebecca, thank you, Daniel, for accepting to be here with us, here in a certain sense, not exactly. But before starting, I would ask Cecilia Pennaccini, as member of the steering committee, to tell a few words on our topic and our hosts. Thank you.
Grazie Gabriella. Io parlerò in italiano, siccome iniziamo il convegno dell'Associazione Italiana di Antropologia Culturale. So che Rebecca e Daniel parlano italiano, quindi possono seguirmi. E quindi mi fa piacere dare il benvenuto a tutti al terzo convegno nazionale della Siac, che oggi inaugura con questa anteprima online e anche in presenza. Sarà un convegno molto ampio, come avete visto dal programma, forse il più grande che l'associazione ha avuto. Abbiamo circa 300 convegnisti. Il tema che il direttivo ha voluto proporre riguarda il futuro, antropologia del futuro, il futuro dell'antropologia. Naturalmente, diciamo, la pandemia ci ha suggerito questo tema, abbiamo subito 2 anni complicati e ci è sembrato importante provare a riflettere tutti insieme su quello che sarà il mondo dopo la pandemia. Sicuramente sarà diverso, come sarà il nostro futuro, ma anche come le società e le culture pensano e immaginano il futuro. È un tema che il convegno, l'avete visto dal programma, declina in tanti modi diversi, in un'apertura molto ricca. Per introdurre il convegno ci è sembrato importante invitare 2 esperti di futuro, Rebecca Bryant e Daniel Knight, che, come ha detto prima Gabriella, hanno dedicato un volume proprio a The Anthropology of the Future, uscito nel 2019 per la Cambridge University Press. È un libro che situa la riflessione sulla temporalità nell'ambito della storia dell'antropologia e anche, diciamo, di una prospettiva filosofica. L'antropologia si è molto concentrata sulle tradizioni, spesso sul passato, anche sulla temporalità, forse un po' meno sul futuro, e qui ci interroghiamo precisamente su questa prospettiva e anche sul tema del cambiamento che le antropologie del futuro implicano. Vorrei introdurre molto brevemente i nostri ospiti per poi lasciare a loro la parola. Rebecca Bryant insegna antropologia culturale all'Università di Utrecht ed è visiting professor alla London School of Economics. Ha fatto ricerca sul campo a Cipro e in Turchia e ha affrontato temi di antropologia politica, confini, conflitti, riconciliazione. Ha pubblicato molto su questi temi. Cito il suo ultimissimo lavoro dopo The Anthropology of the Future, Sovereignty Suspended, Building the So-Called State, con Mit Hatay del 2020. Daniel Knight è ricercatore di antropologia sociale e dirige il Center for Cosmopolitan Studies alla St. Andrew University in Scozia. Ha fatto ricerca sul campo in Grecia, spero che mi sentiate, scusate la mascherina. Ha affrontato i temi della crisi economica, delle economie estrattive, delle energie rinnovabili e della temporanità. Ha pubblicato anche lui estensivamente su questi temi e anche lui ha pubblicato un lavoro molto recente nel 2021 che è Vertiginous Life, an Anthropology of Time and the Unforeseen. Il titolo che hanno dato alla loro lecture di oggi è When the Temporary Becomes Permanent, Crisis and Uncertainty as the New Normal. Quindi io ringrazio ancora i nostri 2 ospiti e lascio la parola a Rebecca. Grazie. Ok, non la sentiamo forse.
You hear me, yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, wonderful. Daniel, I don't know if you want to try sharing now, just to make sure that we can do this without interruption. No, it didn't work. All right. Okay. Well, so what we're going to do is go back and forth in this talk. I don't believe we informed Francisco about this, so we may have to tell you as we do it. But I will begin. And thank you very much for the introduction. As has already been mentioned, Daniel and I published a book, The Anthropology of the Future, a scant 9 months before A virus entered our lives and upended everyone's lives and plans. And the past 18 months have been an interesting test of some of the theses in our book, in which we explore ways that we as anthropologists may study and understand our collective perceptions of time. And indeed, the whole period has been like chapter headings for the book, full of anticipation and expectation, possibility, hope, but also speculation and a sense that this is some sort of destiny, something that as a species we've brought on ourselves. Is there? Ah, okay, good. All right, good. Moreover, in the book, we're particularly concerned with how we experience those orientations to the future collectively, or how a sense of hope or destiny or anticipation may gain collective hold. And we discuss in the book what we call vernacular time spaces as moments when particular futural orientations become collective and give an affective force to the present. So we talk about times of war, times of peace, times of crisis, and other such moments when time for us as a group seems to slow down or speed up. It seems to be flying towards us or flying away from us. And because we share our lives with others, we also share with them what we call the teleoaffective sense of time's rhythm and momentum. So natural disasters or political upheavals or the slow time of the welfare state, we claim, all result in their own collective and affective time spaces. Now, over the past 18 months, we've experienced this as the time of COVID. For the first time in our lifetimes, at least, there's been a sense that this particular vernacular time space is global. All around the world, people trapped in their homes empathize with each other on social media about suddenly feeling that time has become both sluggish and slipping away. Everything seemed to be the same, and yet days passed very quickly. We're all anxious with the world turned upside down, and yet literally stopped in its tracks. And no event in our lifetimes ever prepared us for such an unprecedented global shutdown. Nothing had prepared us for terms like social distancing or the new normal. Yet if one thing consoled us, it was the knowledge that everyone, everywhere was experiencing something similar. Of course, we knew that gendered, economic, and other inequalities rendered that experience worse for some and gentler for others. But still, we saw giants like the US or UK laid low by something as tiny and as visible as a virus, making things seem a bit more equal. And we had a sense, mostly from anxious posts on Facebook or Twitter, that people across the world were all anxious in their isolation. That around the globe, everyone was turning into the nightly news for case numbers that day. Social media particularly did give many of us a sense that we're all in it together. Now, our joint keynote today takes important future-oriented themes from our research, themes that we've individually been thinking about for many years, and asks that they have something to tell us about this period that we've been living through. The talk also gives us an opportunity to discuss how our individual projects on how people construct futures in the present have moved on since our co-authored book. For more than a decade now, Daniel has been working on a crisis that has become chronic, while I've been studying what happens to a community that lives with the collective experience of uncertainty over decades. In this talk, then, we'll each discuss our ongoing research, how it relates to our book, and what we believe it says about the moment in which we're living today. So I will now turn to Daniel.
Thank you, Rebecca. So my first part of the talk will be talking about my research on how a temporary event, something like an economic crisis that was supposed to be a rupture in some form of linear historical temporal continuity, has become a chronic state of affairs in Greece. So I'm talking about this area of Greece, Trikala, and the region of Thessaly, right in the central mainland, very much off the tourist trail, and away from, importantly, the social media eyes for the last 10 years or so. So when we see about the Greek crisis, we often hear about Athens, perhaps Thessaloniki, but very rarely what's happened in the rural periphery of the mainland. This is just some pretty pictures to accompanying the first part of the talk. The plain of Thessaly, a big agricultural plain, the town of Trikala, which is built up around the agricultural economy, and also in the middle of all this, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the so-called monasteries in the sky of Meteora. So in ancient Greek, crisis is defined as a decision-making moment or a point of judgment. In recent years, both in popular imagination and scholarly debates, crisis has come to signify a temporary rupture in temporal, material, perhaps even existential continuity. Something unexpected, often violent, outside the norm, coming in from left field. Yet in Greece, the crisis of 2008-9, when the country's economy collapsed with massive social repercussions, has become a seemingly permanent condition. Over a decade later, what was once characterized as simply troubled times, a blip on the trajectory of late neoliberal Europe, destined to blow over quite shortly, has become an elongated condition of chronic socio-economic deprivation. Something that should pass has become a permanent temporary state of affairs. The crisis event of global financial meltdown that triggered calamitous regional economic failures in places such as Greece has been characterized by my research participants as a time space of captivity. People express feeling stuck in this vertiginous whirlpool of the present, where apathy or resignation towards the future often reign supreme. While the future might often be described as empty, there's also an uncomfortable comfort with the state of chronic crisis, with people now feeling that they know how to navigate captivity, chiseling out life in a state of perpetual suspension between collapsed social orders on the one hand and the emergent world not yet visible on the other. So an event Siac muses is the surprising emergence of something new, which undermines every stable scheme. It is shocking, out of joint, and interrupts the usual flow of things. For Vina Das, these certain critical events annihilate and recreate the world. Crises exceed or defeat the expectations of structure or routine, what is anticipated under normal circumstances. Events occur, Marshall Salins tells us, when structure cannot replicate itself in an expected way. But what happens when a major schism, a crisis such as the global financial collapse or even the COVID-19 pandemic becomes normalized? When it remains part of the social fabric beyond the temporal boundaries of a single event? What happens to future orientations when a dramatic unforeseen rupture becomes a chronic state of existence with a sense of permanency? So these are some pictures of the living with crisis in the plains of Thessaly, which will become apparent as I go on. So the 2009-10 crisis has lost its eventedness, and the people of Greece are left to pick through the aftermath of a decade-long whirlwind that has reordered life. And to provocatively paraphrase Charles Stewart, it has colonized the Greek mind. I argue here that crisis has become a form of captivity, where routinization has led to an uncomfortable comfort with the status quo. Disillusioned with concepts of future emergence and having learned to negotiate the extreme changes brought upon all domains of life, people in Greece have become accustomed to crisis to the extent that they have found ways to operate within and alongside the framework of the new normal. Like Rebecca later on, I will draw on psychological term, Stockholm Syndrome in my case, that has become part of local vernaculars to discuss the relationships between people caught in the clutches of crisis that has transcended the time space of an event. One way to approach the long-term impact of living in chronic crisis, where crisis acquires an enduring hold on people, is through the lens of slow or axiomatic violence. Slow violence recognizes the repetitive erosive nature of living in conditions of increased social suffering, where dramatic change is experienced no longer as a jolting schism, but has become normalized, perhaps even accepted as necessary. Slow violence unfolds with the sluggish temporalities of suffering, where the spectacle of events fade into normalcy and become axiomatic, in the terms of Stavroula Pepirou and Antonio Sorge in a recent publication, Axiomatic Violence. It is the little things that in the context of little things that eat away at the person in the new state of normalcy and obscure the view of what once might have been considered ordinary. At first glance, the dramatic high-impact consequences of crisis may not be visible. There are no Molotov cocktails being hurled at Parliament, no running commentary on the rising suicide cases in places like Greece. but the gradual brutalities of chronic crisis are often as destructive as the time of rupture itself. In Greece, the explosive and sensational event of the economic crisis continues to have repercussions on everyday life, like the residue shockwaves of the Big Bang, still shaping the extremities of the universe 14 billion years on. But what is rarely openly contested is the manner seen during the first years of the event. Instead, crisis has been adopted as the marker of a generation, an epochal identifier rather than a rupture, where people adapt to the ordinariness of the once extraordinary. This violent ordinariness has led to what Laurent Berlant calls a general wearing out, whereby deterioration becomes a defining condition of the historical existence. I would suggest that crisis in Greece has now become epochal, extending far beyond the spatial temporal coordinates of the event itself, moving from episodic to endemic. The epoch structures and orients distinct possibilities for moral and political action, endorsing pathways towards self-determination in the quagmire of endemic turmoil. So in order to better grasp the moral intricacies and practical dynamics of fashioning livelihoods in chronic crisis, anthropologists must answer Henrik Wei's call to approach crisis as a context. He says it's a terrain of action and meaning rather than an aberration. In his seminal paper, Crisis and Chronicity, Vai advocates the departure from perceiving crisis as a momentary phenomena in favor of an understanding of critical states as pervasive context. In many parts of the world, he argues, crisis is not an intermediary moment of chaos, but an ordinary state where people are forced to make lives in fragmented and volatile worlds rather than waiting for normalization and reconfiguration. Through reflexive routinization, people order disorder, to act and live in it, to gain a modicum of control, and fashion out new orientations to once defeated futures. I argue here that the uncomfortable comfort with crisis expressed by an increasing number of Greeks equates to a form of Stockholm Syndrome, identification with a context of captivity, where future horizons are paradoxically often feared, emergence sometimes completely undesired, and the chronic status quo seen as a place of relative safety and security. So these are some depictions in the Greek popular press of Stockholm Syndrome. And this is from the political side of things, so the Greek idea of political Stockholm Syndrome, to the economy, to the social and visual repercussions of what this psychological term once meant, and how it can perhaps be scaled from an individual psychological condition to a sociological descriptive of a nation in the captivity of crisis. So on the 27th of March 2017, the conservative newspaper Kathimerini ran an article on Greece's Stockholm Syndrome. The piece, published in the Greek economics section, discussed how living with crisis had become naturalized, the new normal, even at times a positive thing. They highlighted increasing e-commerce, plastic transactions, and reduced tax evasion. Stockholm Syndrome has appeared regularly in the Greek print media to frame the experiences of a nation held captive by foreign creditors and inept political figures. Although authors offer politically nuanced opinions on accountability, Stockholm Syndrome as a method to frame chronic crisis has adorned the pages of the national press and reflects grassroots narrative referencing the captivity of crisis. Captivity, I suggest, is the resonant aesthetic that signifies the inescapability of the practical and effective roller coaster that is chronic crisis. I argue for a scaling up of individual captivity narratives to an overarching resonant atmosphere of societal captivity that exists in a time of chronic crisis. The routinization of captivity provides a degree of comfort, even identification with the new normal, as suggested in the numerous Greek media articles. It is the increasing familiarity with a state of captivity that I frame as Stockholm Syndrome. This is an expressive modality, a vernacular theory, a way of seeing the world, an intimation of the way it all makes sense, paraphrase Susan Lepsalter. After more than a decade of structural austerity, seeing social relations through the prism of Stockholm Syndrome provides insight into how people locate themselves within the perceived permanence of crisis and scrambled, often curtailed trajectories to the future. With crisis now the mundane background of daily life, people have established an intimate familiarity an affective intimacy, in Rebecca's terms that she will mention later on, with living in crisis. The strangeness of crisis has become ordinary, captivity itself proving transformative, where personal fragility is encompassed by a form of structural familiarity. Stockholm Syndrome can be both a personal psychological condition and a societal issue shared by a group living through the same transformative conditions. The primary concern in both cases is simply survival. It is on these terms that I suggest Stockholm Syndrome can be used as a vernacular resource to represent individual and societal reactions to a chronic time of crisis. The trope of Stockholm Syndrome provides insight into how people embrace the permanency of a time of crisis with its own temporal rhythms and orientations, and they craft a life among the rubble of crisis. So thinking about our book on the anthropology of the future, potentiality, hopes, and aspirations for the future are projected within the time space of chronic crisis, rarely breaching the future horizon outside of this new normal. I fear the future, Christina tells me as we walk through the bustling streets of the Monday market in late 2017. Years ago, she said, I could not wait to escape this crisis. The pressures of the new taxes, the anxiety of constantly pending unemployment, the crazy political talk that surrounds us every day. But now, she says, we have all learned to cope. A self-employed 38-year-old mother of two, Christina echoes the views of an increasing majority of my research participants when she states that people have become accustomed to living in crisis. She says we are surrounded by crisis 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, wherever you look. So a decade on from the onset of fiscal austerity, the latest episodes of the never-ending saga continue to be played out around the clock on television and in daily newspapers. Christina says, the electricity bill on my kitchen table announces the most recent tax rises. My son's second-hand clothes. When I ride my bicycle to work instead of taking the car, she got rid of it in 2012 as it was too expensive to run. These are the things, she says, that remind me that crisis is here to stay. For Greek youth, a time of crisis is all that they have known. The so-called crisis generation have been raised in a world where the vernacular is austerity, memoranda, troika. The key affects being suppression, nausea, disenfranchisement, and more recently, apathy and exhaustion toward the future. The existence of everyday life is fixed in what Lewis Gordon, writing on the permanence of catastrophe in the post-financial crisis age, calls a cultural disaster that leads to a rallying of forces against the future. In conversation with Christina as far back as 2014, she was mentioning that she was no longer fighting the economic crisis that was infiltrating every aspect of her daily life, but rather she was learning to live alongside and within the crisis. And this is a phrase that we have become quite familiar with in the COVID-19 age, about living alongside the virus and living within the type of global circumstances we find ourselves, not expecting to return to the old normal. For Christina and many others, it was a choice between either accepting the status quo or, in her words, going mad. Eventually, if you listen to all the commentators on television, she says, and you continue to discuss the crisis with friends or pay too much attention to the bills on your kitchen table, you will fall sick, she says. You will go dizzy, lose any sense of self. Christina says that the crisis is permanent, it is singular, and we have accepted that. We have learned to survive, diversified our lives, found pockets of existence to navigate the perpetual whirlpool of crisis. Poignantly, Christina insists that she and her friends are now comfortable with the crisis, that they know how to navigate the suffocating consequences of austerity enforced by their crypto-colonial occupiers that have suppressed them for so long. She has found what Olga Shevchenko, working in the post-socialist context, has termed the competent navigation of perpetual crisis, where the future is often simply more of the same. Talk of a post-crisis future, Christina adds, only makes people more anxious, to the point of physically vomiting with the fear of the unknown. The intimacy felt with the crisis situation means that any discussion of emergence is met at best with apathy, often ridicule, sometimes remarkable fear, as the post-crisis future becomes an illusion that is difficult to sustain. So permanence as a primary temporal orientation of crisis can be considered more devastating than apocalyptic scenarios of annihilation, since the latter leaves nothing for reflection. This ethos is captured expertly by a precariously employed 40-year-old research participant called Costas, when he says, when you realize there is no end to crisis, that you cannot trust the promises of anybody, you seek sanctuary in that which you know. I know how to live in crisis, he says. It is normal now. Providing for a family of 4 during the austerity years, electrician Costas states that only he can defend the family from further harm inflicted by those who have big ideas about the future of Greece. He says we know that they don't care any more than our current occupiers. When I quiz Costas to further explain his desires to maintain current political and economic conditions, even when politicians and bureaucrats are boldly claiming a bright future for the emergent post-crisis Greek nation, he says, I know that you outsiders might not understand it. It might seem strange, but fighting for our future away from crisis now seems futile, even unnecessary. We no longer know who to trust and who is lying. I laugh at them all, and I just say, I will focus on my own life, and for that, I need security. I have become accustomed to crisis. I know crisis, he says. Costas places more trust in his current captors, who he sees as Northern European neoliberals, even Germans and big banks, than his own prime minister, who offers promises of emergence. What might be seemingly illogical to outsiders, the desire to maintain a time of crisis, owing to the uncomfortable comfort of the status quo, is the Stockholm Syndrome effect of the epoch that I suggest. So as it was mentioned there, this is the new book where I've been trying to chart the lives of people over the course of the decade. And the chapters of this book are following individual life stories of how people have lived through the economic crisis, first as a rupture that they thought would pass quite quickly, and then how they've become accustomed to this, or how they've managed to navigate this over the course of a whole decade, when it's obviously become a chronic condition. And particularly the vertiginous affects of this, the way they talk about nausea, the dizziness, the sickness, the feeling of loss of previous selves, the breathlessness of this decade, and how that has affected their lives. So building up to a theory of time through these very detailed ethnographic narratives of individuals who have had a decade of life in crisis. So we can observe similar relationships to the condition of chronic crisis throughout Europe. And as Dacia Janowska has argued, an ethnographic focus on themes such as emptiness and maintenance can provide insightful critiques of how people choose to invest or not in futures beyond crisis. For Janowska, during the economic crisis in Latvia, migration away from the deindustrialized, rapidly emptying countryside to work in rural England is an act of seeking futures past, namely of stable employment and small-scale financial prosperity. Remaining in the emptying Latvian countryside is a political act where people create the future as a little bit more of the present, a present of austerity and scarcity. And they do this for the sense of making life go on for just a little bit longer. Her informants in Latvia cling to the epoch of crisis and find comfort in its familiarity. In a comparable case, this time set in the context of post-industrial Germany, Felix Ringel offers critique of the past-present-future relation through the lens of maintenance. In some instances, he argues, people strive to maintain their current living conditions through endurance and sustainability in the face of unwanted accelerated change that offer unfamiliar futures. Working in post-socialist Moscow, sociologist Olga Shevchenko has written on the routinization of crisis, or what she calls the permanence of temporary conditions. Many aspects of life in Moscow after socialism are relatable to the Greek case. Expecting rapid change after the political rupture of the late 1980s, Shevchenko found that for the majority of Muscovites, the post-crisis era brought a continuation of a time of crisis. Akin to how Greeks discussed their concerns that emergence will bring another, perhaps even more punitive, political economic regime, Muscovites lamented the post-socialism offered no stability, no change. Life was unfolding in crisis all of the time, she said. Over previous decades, Muscovites had, Shevchenko suggests, become intimate with the framework of permanent crisis, within which they had managed to develop an entire infrastructure of coping. The permanence of the infrastructure would match the permanence of the crisis and prevent it from disrupting one's life. Shevchenko claims that crisis had become the new habitus, since people reacted to its permanence by fashioning equally permanent ways of dealing with it. In Moscow, the chronic nature of crisis had led to normalization. A new rupture was undesirable. There were possibilities for life within the remit of chronic crisis. This is very similar to what my research participants report when they discuss having learned to live in the time space of crisis, and they are no longer fighting the regime, but finding a way to get on with life, whatever that might look like. As I've suggested above, the physical and psychological effects of Stockholm Syndrome are not confined to individuals in situations of captivity, but can be scaled up to a societal level to be descriptive of relationships between groups, objects, nations, and deities on whom someone has become dependent. Characteristics that may be noticed in societal Stockholm Syndrome and are pertinent to the Greek context include fear of life post-captivity, temporal disorientation, guilt for one's imprisonment, and dependence on and justification for the captor. In the international relations literature, in the context of the latter Cold War years, Stockholm Syndrome was employed as a vernacular resource that referenced societal relations during a transformative epoch. And it is in this manner that I believe Stockholm Syndrome provides a useful discursive framework to think through chronic crisis in Greece. The perspectives described by my research participants, paralysis, stuckness, security and entrapment, fear of life outside of the crisis time space, these reference an intimate relationship with their captors, where survival is of the foremost concern. So wrapping up this section, Stockholm Syndrome, I think, is a useful tool in analysing the fashioning of everyday relations within the condition of chronic crisis. I am reflexively aware that I employ at least 3 terms that could be considered as portraying crisis and the relations within as a pathological condition, and this isn't my intention. So when I talk of crisis state of mind, colonizing the mind, following Charles Stewart, and Stockholm Syndrome, these are meant to be in vernaculars, local vernaculars, and following the sort of societal implications of these, rather than suggesting psychological pathologization. These are local vernaculars tied to wider cultural repertoires that identify how people understand life in chronic crisis under the so-called Troika occupation and its aftermath. Chronic crisis does not necessarily equal total destruction, since people are resourceful, aptly adapting as future horizons of expectation, collapse, reform, fail, and repeat. With sovereignty removed, people have invested a great deal of emotion and energy in finding coping strategies that transcend the renegotiated living conditions of often extreme poverty and precarity. They have chiseled out a space for life within crisis. In Greece, crisis has become the usual flow and stable scheme, which provides what Bina Das calls a reference point for everyday life. When the economic crisis hit, the event shattered ordinary life. It was a rupture, a transformation of reality that acted as a transcendental placeholder and means for signifying contingency. But having lost its eventedness, crisis has been turned into a symbolic resource with which people identify and orient their lives. The Analytic of Stockholm Syndrome helps unpack a time of crisis marked by a sense of permanence. Costas describes how he trusts the structure of internationally enforced reforms that have guided his life for more than a decade, more than he trusts his own prime minister's promises to rescue him from the hands of foreign captors. Others state their acceptance of the status quo, living under the thumb of crypto-colonial powers. One informant describes how crisis is his safe place, and in the here and now, a paralysis he has learned to live with as the new normal. The critical event losing its eventedness has led to crisis as normalcy, resulting in stability both in the social environment and in people's expectations for the future. Crisis has become epochal. The reflexive routinization of crisis has led to people being able to act and live in this state of disorder. Now that they have gained a modicum of control over life after the initial spectacular rupture, they do not engage in imaginations of emergence, a return to the future's past, lest they lose control. Deterioration has become part of historical experience, a familiar landscape where livelihoods are fashioned in the uncomfortable comfort of a chronic condition. Once fascination with bond yields, deficit graphs, bailout negotiations, and comparative tax policies had faded, an event became the status quo. The new normal was no longer feared. Future horizons had changed, but life went on, within the familiarity of chronic crisis. I'll pass over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm unmuted, yes? Okay, great. Now, one widespread phenomenon during this pandemic, as Daniel also mentioned at one point, seems to have been an anxious fascination with numbers. Certainly I, along with most people I knew, spent the first months of the pandemic constantly tracking case numbers, hospitalizations, deaths. We read a lot of graphs in which numbers went up in sharp spikes and gradually came down. Perhaps we were looking for patterns that would make it all seem less random. During that period, you may have noticed, if you were also following these graphs, that tiny countries such as Taiwan and New Zealand fared better than most, in large part because as islands, they could easily lock down their borders and control their relatively small populations. And when the lockdowns began, I was in one such small country, the island of Cyprus. But I was not just on the island. I was in the north of the island, which is under the control of an unrecognized state that's supported by Turkey. And I would spend most of the rest of the next 18 months of this pandemic period there. And at the beginning of that period, I was starting to revise a book manuscript that was, among other things, about remoteness and isolation. And this just is a way for you to sort of situate yourselves geographically. So the book manuscript is at least partly about remoteness and isolation, or how particular places can become geopolitical black holes. North Cyprus is one such place because it's a breakaway state that's been condemned by the United Nations and embargoed and isolated as a result. Such would-be states are often described as pirates or pariahs or rogues, making them deviant outcasts of the international community. Or they're described as places that don't exist, a term that geopolitically erases them. Either way, we might see areas such as North Cyprus as what Ruben Anderson in a recent book describes as a red zone or a no-go zone, of the sort that are today proliferating on world maps. These spaces, he argues, are created through a global cartopolitics of danger and distance making. That's a quote. A geopolitics of differentiation that makes even close spaces seem remote from us, and moreover seem that they should stay that way. Now, one chapter that I've been revising is about how that distance making is epistemological, making a space like North Cyprus into a place that cannot be known because it should not be seen or acknowledged. And this epistemological isolation became a matter of considerable anxiety for many people in this space when the pandemic hit, and we saw that our particular geopolitical black hole wasn't even a dot on the World Health Organization's radar. We were never included in those numbers and graphs that we nevertheless anxiously followed. Of course, initially a viral outbreak in a Chinese province seemed very far away. However, within days of news about the situation in Italy, right, making world headlines, isolating walls suddenly appeared everywhere around us. First, the internal border that divides the island shut. So on this map, it's that gray line that runs through, it's the buffer zone. Then planes and boats stopped, and then we were confined to our houses. Now, of course, isolation was hard on everyone, but I think it takes on a particular valence when you're on an island with no way off or on. It was both terrifying and comforting at the same time. You definitely feel remote or cut off from the world, but also cocooned from what's happening outside. And we remained that way for several months. So like everywhere, we felt much uncertainty. And yet that uncertainty was only another variation on the endemic uncertainty that is already part of life in unrecognized and isolated entities. Because of non-recognition, other states refuse to see these entities, to interact with them, and the UN and other bodies keep no official statistics on them. Indeed, at the moment the pandemic hit, I was writing about the chronic uncertainty produced by this geopolitical erasure and isolation. So my part of this presentation uses the chronic uncertainty that seems to be a pervasive part of life in unrecognized states to think about the growing uncertainty and unease that pervades the life of so many of us today. This allows me to link two different strands of my work, one on temporalities and futures and the other on states and sovereignty, by thinking about how the state becomes the main provider of expectations and how geopolitics enters our everyday lives. In particular, I want to think about what it means to have a future and why, for so many of us, having a state that works is a necessary condition for that, or seems to be a necessary condition for that. And in particular, I'm going to use a psychological term, as Daniel did, that has made its way into the Turkish Cypriot vernacular to help explain this, learned helplessness, or the depression that ensues when subjects are subjected repeatedly to stimuli beyond their control. Now, helplessness is also a futural orientation, but one that occurs when the expectations of everyday life seem to be replaced by contingency. In my part of the paper, then, I'm going to say a few words about contingency and stateness before turning to learned helplessness and chronic uncertainty. And in the conclusion of our talk, we'll then reflect a bit on what these observations may tell us about our present moment. Before doing all that, though, I want to start with a story. In early March 2020, the virus was only beginning to hit Italy and still seemed far away from us. And at that time, when we still seemed safe, the president of the Republic of Cyprus, the recognized entity in the island south, suddenly decided to close the checkpoints preemptively, the checkpoints that lead to the north of the island. And so this was preemptive or a precaution, but it seemed strange to those of us then in the north, because after all, it's an area that's even more isolated than the south and doesn't have the same amount of mass tourism that might bring the virus. And indeed, at that point, there was still the sense that the virus just wouldn't reach us. And in that window of about 10 days between the checkpoints closing and North Cyprus also going into full lockdown, I went to a picnic with some friends of varying ages. And this is just a nice slide of approximately where we went on this picnic. And people then began talking about why President Anastasiades would have closed the checkpoints when at that moment there were still no cases on the island. At one point, a young woman in her late 20s, whom I'll call Begum, articulated what was on many people's minds when she asked, "What will we do now? My generation knows the open checkpoints. We went to Europe, we studied there." After Begum's anxious question, everyone at the picnic began excitedly talking all at once about the closures, about what was going to happen. And after a few minutes, the conversation fizzled out. And at that moment, a young man around Begum's age, who had also studied abroad, stared across the fields at the sea and sighed, "We live in such a beautiful country, and yet we can't live." Everyone in the group nodded. Picking up on this remark, another friend, Mariam, made what to an outsider looking at the scene may have appeared to be a logical leap, but which to all of us there made perfect sense. We don't know what we are in the world, and uncertainty, and then the who are we question comes in. The conversation then moved from the sense of anxiety produced by the closed borders to an expression of being unable to truly live despite living in a beautiful country, to a generalized uncertainty and sense of not knowing who one is in the world. The fact that to all of us, these connections made perfect sense points us to some of the fundamental elements of living in a place that the rest of the world refuses to see and whose citizens view their lives as abnormal and long for normalization. And this is, I just put this slide on because this is a book that I also recently published last year, which actually charts the ways in which people have tried to craft their lives in this condition of non-recognition and what they consider to be abnormality and that causes them to desire normalization. So like many of us imagining returning to some kind of normal after COVID, the abnormality of their lives is out of their control. It's a result of a political problem that began long before any of my friends at the picnic that day were born. Normalization is what those friends expect once negotiations reach a conclusion on this long-standing frozen conflict. So what normalization means for most is the opposite of uncertainty, or belirsizlik, as they say, the perpetual state that they've found themselves in for decades. Uncertainty is a word that Turkish Cypriots use constantly to express the situation of not knowing their place in the world or where they're going. So uncertainty, or belirsizlik, is also what defines their lives as abnormal, a type of what Ghassan Haag calls temporal stuckness. Or one civil servant, former civil servant, expressed it to me: when we were rising from people to nation, we got hung somewhere in the middle. One young businesswoman explained it to me via shipping, as she's tried to build a technology company despite all the problems created by embargoes. So over lunch, she described her most recent import difficulties when it took her 3 tries to order a shipment of parts from Germany. The shipment went one time to the Greek side, and one time it got stuck in Turkey and sent back to Germany. It only reached North Cyprus on the 3rd try. In other words, somehow it reaches the TRNC, North Cyprus, but I lose time and money along the way. It bothers me that this place doesn't even have its own postal code. So at the time of our conversation, there had been another failed round of negotiations that had just ended, and this had raised hopes of a solution just to dash them again. Instead of a solution, then, she remarked, and this is a quote, "At the moment, we're in a very clear and obvious state of uncertainty." Now, this young woman's expression, "a clear and obvious state of uncertainty," is one with which almost any Turkish Cypriot would agree, perhaps especially in its irony. On television and radio programs, in newspapers, and in conversations in restaurants and homes and picnics, Turkish Cypriots discuss and lament uncertainty, this state of prolonged unknowing that makes the future unpredictable. It's a liminal present in which they describe themselves as stuck, unable to move forward into a different future. Now, this idea of liminality or stuckness is often present in descriptions of these entities themselves, which are so often called states in waiting or states in limbo. Such labels paint them as always kept at the threshold of the community of nations, never let in. As such, the description of them as liminal entities seems spatial, yet clearly the metaphor of being unable to move forward, of being hung or stuck, or as we put in the title of this book, suspended, right, is a temporal one. Without recognition, the future remains uncertain, meaning that it's not something that one can expect, and indeed many people complain that it never really arrives. Or if it does arrive, it only arrives, like my friend's shipment of computer parts, as a surprise. And I'll return to this shortly. There is, in other words, a perceived relationship between isolation and the future, between closed borders and not knowing who one is in the world. Although Cyprus may not seem like a remote place, the isolation of the island's north certainly makes it feel remote, especially did when I first started doing research there in the early 90s. It makes it feel cut off or excluded from the international order. And in the 1980s, Edwin Ardner attempted to theorize such remoteness, and in a prescient statement of our current COVID-19 dilemmas, he remarked that those places that we see as remote are not so because of actual physical remoteness, but because of, and I'm quoting, a structural relationship of social distancing. Now, this remark certainly applies to unrecognized states, which have been socially distanced for decades through political mechanisms of isolation, exclusion, and embargo. Now, we all know, at least since Johannes Fabian's time and the other, that isolation and alacrity go together. Remote places seem to exist in a different time. And as I mentioned a moment ago, when I first arrived in North Cyprus in the 1990s, the North's isolation did give one a sense of being cut off from the world, being in a type of protected bubble that many visitors described as untouched or frozen in time. The idea of being frozen in the past was visible in goods like out-of-date fashions and older cars, a direct result of embargo and the frozen conflict. However, this was something that the Turkish Cypriot tourism sector also marketed, comparing it with the mass tourism development in the south, beside which it seemed almost virginal, as one slogan had it. Now, during that same period, Turkish Cypriots often expressed this sense of alachrony by complaining that nothing happens here. They condensed this in a popular metaphor for their condition that took hold of the public imagination in the early 2000s. The metaphor of being in a fishbowl, isolated, but able to see the rest of the world and always turning in the same place. And this is just a newspaper clipping where this fishbowl metaphor was first used, and it became a very constantly used metaphor for this situation. So this fishbowl metaphor, as I say, was about isolation. It was about being able to look out and see the world, but always turning in the same place. And of course, surely that description bears resemblance to what we all felt looking out our windows during the period of pandemic isolation. Now, with the world going on outside the glass of one's fishbowl, it may be easy to wonder, with my friend Mariam, who one is in the world. What forces have kept you there? And uncertainty, as she remarked. And then the who are we question comes in. The paradox is that one might think that if you're in a place where nothing happens, where everything seems the same, that you would know what's going to happen the next day. Why then do people living in such isolated entities complain of uncertainty? And why does this lead to questions about who they are? The key, I think, actually lies in the fishbowl metaphor. The journalist who first used it in this article and immediately popularized it repeatedly talked about the fish turning and turning in its aquarium, much like we turned and turned in our homes for months on end. In its fishbowl, the fish continuously swims but goes nowhere. The metaphor refers then not only to spatial confinement, but to a truncation of the temporal trajectory of their lives. The state, moreover, is considered abnormal. A fish should not be in a tiny fish bowl, but in a pond or even an ocean. Isolation and stalled time then seem intrinsically linked. And just to mix metaphors a bit, the fish is stuck forever, in this instance, turning circles in the glass walls of a frozen conflict. Moreover, like the pandemic, the frozen conflict is something that should go away and yet never does. Negotiations start and then stall. Solutions appear and then crumble when spoilers, like viral variants, suddenly appear to breed dissent and distrust. The very idea of the frozen conflict is precisely the idea that a glitch in the normal state of affairs over time becomes a new normal. It's a permanently temporary state of affairs that upends what we can expect in our everyday lives. Now, if you happen to read our book, The Anthropology of the Future, you'll know that there's an argument in chapter 2 that the expectation of expectation grounds normal lives and constitutes the idea of having a future. What I want to suggest here is that the exception of unrecognized states can reveal once again how much we count on the state to provide us with that grounds of expectation and what we think of as normal lives, particularly by seeing how citizens perceive their lives as abnormal in the absence of a normal state. And I should open a small parenthesis here just to say that my invocation of the state here, it has to do, as we discuss in this other book that I showed a moment ago, Sovereignty Suspended, has of course to do with certain kinds of expectations of what the state is and does that are themselves cultivated through certain kinds of historical trajectories. But in this case, we can say that certainly within anthropology, there has been a literature that has developed that makes this link between the state and normal lives. In, for example, places like the former Yugoslavia, where ethnography has shown that people tend to link their desires for normal lives to having a state that works, as they express it. There's also quite a large literature on the retreat of the welfare state in an age of neoliberalism that reinforces the idea that there's something about our conception of what a state should do that makes us expect it to anchor the everyday and allow us to have a future. Now, what I'm suggesting here is not just that it's the job of states to plan for the future and to provide us with security to go on with our lives. Rather, I want to suggest that the expectation of expectation, or the distant horizon of expectation that we associate with the state, is an important part of what Timothy Mitchell calls the state effect that makes us feel like we live in a quote unquote real state. It should not be surprising, I think, that the expectation of expectation should be tied to our idea of the state, since descriptions of the state, at least since Baudin and Hobbes, view it as something continues beyond the ephemerality of human life. People die, but the state goes on. Or we might say with Philip Abrams that the state is a useful abstraction because the idea of the state allows us to imagine something that encompasses and temporarily exceeds the various governments and political parties that control it. So governments change, but the state goes on. Moreover, the idea that the state becomes the ground of temporal continuity in our lives seems to be one of the main reasons that we have, that so many people, so many of our interlocutors have trouble thinking beyond it. Beyond the state is only contingency, construed in international relations as anarchy or chaos. Indeed, one might argue that the very fact of having a sovereign state in the Westphalian sense is to provide such continuity, what Hobbes referred to as a type of immortality, when he noted that commonwealths, quote, are designed to live as long as mankind or as the laws of nature or as justice itself, unquote. And certainly a number of political theorists have argued that the whole point of a state controlling territory is to control time, and specifically the future. Some, such as Liam Stockdale, who's written quite a lot on this subject, argue that the whole point of sovereignty is to provide what he calls a, quote, bulwark against temporal contingency, relegating contingency to the outside, beyond the borders. And here I think we get to the crux of the matter. In this view, the normative order of sovereignty intends to provide certainty and regularity in a particular space where we can pursue our ends. Again, in this view, we can say that we have a real state, a sovereign state, when it can provide the grounds for having a future. If we think again about the fishbowl metaphor, we see that it provides no such grounds. Rather than providing the continuity and regularity that enable us to act towards ends, it's a space of temporal entrapment. The fish turning always in circles without understanding why it can't leave. Moreover, the glass of a fishbowl allows us to see the normal world outside, where real life seems to go on. Elsewhere, in a recent article in Cultural Anthropology, I talk about this truncation of the future as foreclosure, having all one's political options blocked or prohibited, and even having expression of certain desires censored. But what is foreclosure? Now, according to the dictionary definition, to foreclose is to rule out a course of action, meaning that you decide in advance that it's not possible or won't happen. Like my friend who couldn't get her shipment of computer parts, you begin to expect that it will never arrive. And when it does, it comes as a surprise. The so-called normal grounds of expectation are overturned. What we should be able to expect, ordering computer parts and having them arrive, becomes the unexpected. The contingency that the state is supposed to protect us from instead becomes a routine part of our daily lives. And here's where we come to the connection that Miriam makes between uncertainty and not knowing who we are in the world. The link that she makes is one that many of my interlocutors today describe with the psychological term learned helplessness. This is another term that first appeared in a newspaper article and then became part of public discourse, like Daniel's Stockholm Syndrome, or like the fishbowl. Turkish Cypriots immediately appropriated the term as a way to describe their sense of powerlessness in the world and the depression and demoralization that have ensued. In its first iteration in psychology, learned helplessness was used to describe the way that rats in a cage who repeatedly receive aversive stimuli when they tried to reach food eventually stopped even trying. What many psychologists consider important here is that there was no pattern to the aversive stimuli. Rats could not predict, if we can use that word, when the aversive stimuli would occur, so they couldn't learn how to avoid them. The aversive stimuli were simply random or contingent. And as a result, the rats just accepted that whatever they did would be useless. Indeed, they gave up to such an extent that many began to starve. Now, in my own ethnographic context, you can see the internalization of learned helplessness quite clearly in a series of greetings that's used all day, every day, by almost everyone. So much so, in fact, that it's become a t-shirt. The person initiating the greetings asks, "Napan," which in Turkish Cypriot dialect literally means, "What are you doing?" and is used to ask, "How are you?" The answer is not, what you might expect, such as, I don't know, "Oh, I'm fine," or "not doing badly." Rather, the answer is "Napim," or meaning, "What can I do?" or "What should I do?" This answer is always said with a certain amount of resignation, implying that one's situation is such that there's little to do about it. The response to this answer, in turn, is "E napacan." This reply means, well, what can one do? A reply that's usually accompanied by a shrug of the shoulders and that says there's nothing for anyone to do about the situation. This series of greetings, as you see here, has been turned into t-shirts and slogans that give to it an affective intimacy. In other words, the normalization of helplessness has become part of what it means to be a member of this community. If you understand the t-shirt, you understand what it is to live like a rat in a cage or a fish in a bowl. Like Daniel's Stockholm Syndrome, then, many people that I know say that they want to be released from a lifetime of uncertainty, like a rat leaving its cage or a fish being released into the ocean. Yet people also know that, like my experience of lockdown in an unrecognized state, the cage or fishbowl is also a cocoon, a place of safety. For this reason, one right-wing party in one election used this fishbowl metaphor to claim that the left-wing parties wanted, in their political ambitions, to release the little fish not into the free world of the ocean, but rather into a world in which giant fish would just swallow it up. Right? Or in another caricature from around the same period, the fish wishes for someone to turn the bottle on its side so that it can, as it says here, escape a bit from this isolation. However, the fish does not wish someone to come and open the bottle, as that sort of escape from isolation would also mean its death. Rather, the implication is just that if the bottle were horizontal, if it were on its side, the fish could have a bit more room to swim without leaving its safe environment. I'll now turn back to Daniel for a conclusion that will draw together these two parts of our talk.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think there's more that can be said there on the link between the state and the future and the expectation that the state provides. Certainly from a Scottish perspective, I mentioned to Rebecca discussing this informally before this lecture, the COVID pandemic has really hit home in Scotland, where Scotland has a certain devolved power in healthcare and education, and where we are not really a state at all, and everything is determined from Westminster. And I think that's a part of the discussion which isn't here in the conclusion, which might be quite fruitful to have later on, the links between the state and the future in other contexts. But anyway, so what can our work on chronic states of crisis and chronic states of uncertainty tell us about the current condition of entrapment in the COVID-19 pandemic? Future horizons keep shifting. We are told that it will take 6 months, 1 year, a decade for emergence from this crisis. We are allowed to travel to A, B, and C countries, but not X, Y, and Z, unless we spend 2, 5, 10 days in quarantine. When the numbers hit 10,000 cases a day, we can fully return to normal. But at 40,000 cases a day, as we are in the UK, we stay at beyond level 0 of the government's response criteria, having lived at level 5 at peak pandemic. They are rather contradictory numbers. Learning to turn our attention away from these numbers, or at least appreciate their relative place within the long pandemic time space, may be the key to making those first small steps into the post-pandemic future. For me personally, the most fear-inducing and perhaps ominous phrase that has circulated since the start of the pandemic is the idea of a new normal. When I first heard this at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, it really struck me to the core. If we're supposed to be carving out lives within a new normal, then we are being asked to kiss goodbye to life as we previously knew it. There will be no return to the normal of the past, no normal normal. Of course, the idea of us all ever sharing a standard normal before the pandemic is both essentialist and normative thinking to the extreme. But the realization of no return is both daunting and tinged with sadness. Reflecting back, the old normal is now viewed quite nostalgically as a bounded epoch, with teleoethics quite different to this brave new world we face. There is now an atmosphere, again I paraphrase Susan Lepsdalter, writing on the resonance of things unseen, an atmosphere that the world is spinning. There is an apparent shift in temporal rhythms, and objects, sights, and sounds have become uncanny. There is the sense, the feeling of epochal change. Nothing will ever be the same, out with the old and in with the something else. The new normal also contains within it a register of permanence that goes against what we might commonly understand as a once-in-a-lifetime event, and also contradicts our sense of agency and novelty in future making. A pandemic, like an economic crisis or an intra-island conflict, is surely meant to be a passing rupture, an unexpected episode that will eventually give way to the actualization of once expected futures. Yet the new normal suggests that those future horizons may never be in sight, that living alongside the COVID-19 virus and the personal and collective sacrifices that entails is anticipated to become a chronic condition. We suggest that to better comprehend how critical ruptures become the status quo, we may look to places like Greece and Northern Cyprus. Events have lost their eventedness. The temporary has become permanent. Permanence here is itself an orientation where some future horizons are always just out of reach. The spatial and temporal horizons of life have been redefined by the permanent temporary state of crisis and uncertainty. But people have found ways to carve out life, even expressing a degree of uncomfortable comfort with the chronic state of affairs. It is interesting that both of us have decided to draw on psychological concepts that have made their way into local vernaculars to describe life stuck in chronic crisis and uncertainty. And in both cases, the concepts are more deeply embedded in cultural repertoires of resignation and the intimate appreciation of collective hardship, indicating that situations are, by and large, out of one's control. In Greece, Stockholm Syndrome identifies the relationship between captor and captee and plays on historical notions of what Michael Herzfeld has termed crypto-colonialism, or the way that the Greek nation has always really been under the control of foreign powers, despite illusions of freedom. This has led to an everyday politics of resignation that are summed up with a quintessential shoulder shrug, says Michael Herzfeld, that may belie the feet frantically paddling under the surface as people try to provide a meaningful momentum to a helpless situation. In the Cypriot case, the learned helplessness of living in an unrecognized island state that is both politically and geographically isolated is expressed by Rebecca's informants alongside daily greetings that normalize helplessness, to the extent that the sayings even have their own t-shirts. In our respective fields, people claim the time space of chronic crisis as their own. finding security within the status quo in a form of affective intimacy, as Rebecca in particular has shown. Although the tempos, rhythms, and future horizons may have changed, time spaces of chronic crisis and uncertainty soon become normalized. Even, it might somewhat be controversially suggested, desired as the unfamiliar is made familiar. As I mentioned earlier, anthropologists such as Felix Ringel and Dutzer Zanowska have argued for maintenance and emptiness as desirable concepts drawn from local vernaculars to orient people's daily activities toward the future in chronic states of decay in Germany and Latvia, respectively. Embracing the status quo and living life for more of the same does have consequences for future momentum and critiques many of the notions at the core of our Anthropology of the Future book. Hopes, expectations, and potentiality, for instance, look very different from the context of chronic crisis and uncertainty, as are personal and collective aspirations and destinies. But I want to end with a short vignette that speaks to the complexity of temporal orientations to the future and the lens through which we choose to view life. In October 2019, my colleague here at St. Andrews, Christos Linderis, presented me with his new book entitled Human Extinction and the Pandemic Imaginary, which I actually unplanned randomly have here. So in Human Extinction and the Pandemic Imaginary, Linderis argued that in medical science, the fear of the next pandemic was not so much about anticipation of mass extinction, but rather about the expectations that humans would lose control over humanity's place in the world. So less than 2 months later, after Christos presented me with this book, less than 2 months later, we heard the news of a new virus being transmitted at a Chinese wet market. Now that book has sat on my desk on its own, isolated throughout the lockdowns, and is an eerie prophecy on the then unimaginable. Its cover makes me physically retch as it tells of a past where our present is the plot of a futuristic, fantastical sci-fi. Yet this pandemic was expected. People wrote books like Christos, they ran scenario programs, and governments plotted responses. So to return to the chapters of our Futures book, if we had addressed case studies from medical science and global health, speculation, expectation, and potentiality would have pointed to a pandemic caused by zoonosis as destiny. A matter of when, not if. The expectation of losing control of humanity's place in the world is something encountered in both Greece and north of Cyprus, the Stockholm Syndrome, learned helplessness. Yet the new normal of chronic instability provides new horizons for future-oriented activity, where hope may be redefined as security, expectation transcends into comfort, and potentiality is realized along alternative trajectories. Yet, as people form effective intimacy with the new normal, so they learn to engage with the future alongside and within the new rhythms and tempos of their era. And we'll leave it there. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think I will take off the mask for a moment. So thank you very much, Daniel and Rebecca. I think it was a very deep and interesting perspective on what we are experiencing now. So I have some questions of my own, but first of all, prima di tutto possiamo iniziare con le domande o qui, se volete, col microfono o attraverso Zoom. Forse se metti la chat, se qualcuno vuole fare domande dal pubblico in italiano o in inglese, può scrivere il suo nome sulla chat o se qualcuno vuole intervenire. A tutti. So maybe I will start just to break. When you were talking, I starting to think very much about Africa, where I've been working for almost 30 years. My fieldwork is in sub-Saharan Africa, in Uganda since 15 years. I was thinking about Africa because in my experience, there are some coincidences from what we are experiencing and what they experienced since colonialism onward. As Daniel said just at the end, I think that in this situation, now we are obliged to think about before and after COVID. There is something which happened in Bantu Africa. Sometimes they use the word mfekane. The Zulu use this word that means a huge disaster. And after mfekane, the word changed. But what happened after colonialism in the Africa that I know is exactly what you described. So they are living since more than 50 years now in a vertiginous life where there is no in uncertainty, even in isolation, because borders oblige people to stay where they live, and generally speaking, without control. But what I've seen in this context is an interesting way to deal with this uncertainty that in African cultures is very much connected with irony, with the capacity of laugh and be happy, even if you don't know what the future will take to you, despite difficulties. So to find the human resources in this kind of situation. So my question is, you didn't mention culture. In my opinion, every culture has its own way to deal with uncertainty, to deal with this big, huge crisis. Which place, which role you give to culture in your perspective? Are there different ways to deal with this situation, or the world is globally experiences this new normality?
Would you like to answer first, Rebecca? No? Okay. Thank you very much. It's very true. I mean, I often thought about Africa in a longer piece of I wrote a different part, I suppose, for a volume dedicated to the late Paul Clough in Malta, who worked on chronic crisis in Western Africa. And it did have resonances indeed with the situations that we found that they became axiomatic after colonialism. But to speak directly to your question, I suppose, we mentioned at the end cultural repertoires of dealing with it. So Rebecca's learned helplessness, my Stockholm Syndrome, were part of a repertoire of dealing with crisis and orienting to the future that had become learned over the course of a long time in these two contexts. So I said there that it's everything from the greetings in Rebecca's case, which they're very similar sorts of greetings in Greece, to the shoulder shrug and the sort of what can we do about this thing. But going deeper than that, you find ways like irony that are that provide political agency. They're not just sort of satirical outbursts as such. And the agency involved in things like ironic acts or futile political acts was another one we've come across recently, which give direction and future direction in a chronic state of uncertainty or crisis. Where I've come unstuck in times talking about how people deal with chronic crisis in Greece, is when I start talking about how people look for innovation and perhaps entrepreneurship inside of a state of crisis. So there's still the sort of economic desires for certain things. There's still a market for certain things in these conditions, and people will diversify businesses, perhaps be quite opportunistic in their economic activities. And then you get the critique that you're sort of pushing this Northern European neoliberal ideal that everybody can be entrepreneurs and everybody can be innovative and everybody can be creative. And it's not really the neoliberal Northern European who is the bad guy. It's the people that should be finding ways to deal with this. And that's particularly obviously not what I'd be trying to argue whatsoever, but certainly the agency, creativity and innovation, which are part of these cultural repertoires in cases of chronic uncertainty and chronic crisis, are relative to their fields. We've presented two cases here, Northern Cyprus and Greece, which historically and culturally perhaps are more connected than would do our argument more justice as such. But I take your point. I think it's a fantastic comparison, and also the whirlpooling sort of vertiginous aspect of it as well. I wonder if Rebecca has any comments on that, the cultural aspect.
Both, as Daniel said, our cases are in many ways historically related to each other. And share a certain number of similarities in terms of these cultural repertoires that Daniel mentioned. I would, rather than talking about culture per se, I mean, I find it interesting to think about historical accretions, or how a kind of historical consciousness seeps into everyday life as a shrug of the shoulders, or as a certain way of responding and behaving. So in that sense, certainly our cases are connected through those kinds of historical accretions or historical consciousness, and that would, of course, offer a certain opportunity to think about what that means. And so maybe that's something that we'll want to pursue in the future. But I would also say that that there is another aspect that comes directly to the, I suppose, to the issue of colonialism, insofar as the post-colonialist condition is lived in places like where I've worked, where performativity is also an important part of this, where I mean, part of being a part of the post-colonial condition is you know, well, narrating one's experience in such a way that there are certain other actors who are always present as a sort of what Daniel Rutherford refers to as a spectral audience, right? And these kinds of spectral audiences, because they have a certain kind of control over one's situation, like in the case of Greece, the Troika, right? Require a certain kind of performance. So there's also this interesting, I think, balancing of forms of expression, where, of course, irony is so often one of the ways in which people create a kind of affective intimacy, as we were talking about. But then there are other repertoires that people call on that are more performative and that respond more directly to this sense that others are watching us and others are controlling our lives.
Ok, sì, abbiamo una domanda in italiano. Dorothy. Allora in inglese. Prego Dorothy, apri tu il microfono. Dorothy Zinn.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I want to thank Rebecca and Daniel for this very stimulating talk, and I've appreciated your examination of the affective dimensions of temporality and especially your concept of vernacular time space. Like Cecilia, this also made me think a bit about the south of Italy, where I've worked for 3 decades. And I had often thought about the fact that people seem to have a continual experience of crisis. Again, in a context that many would argue has had a kind of colonial experience. But anyway, that was just a thought. I'd need to meditate on this a bit more. I have 2 questions. One is just general. I would like to have a comment from you about the temporality of doing your ethnographic work vis-a-vis the temporality of uncertainty and crisis that you were following. And I just would appreciate a comment about that. And a more specific question for Daniel about the Stockholm Syndrome. That is, I have always understood Stockholm Syndrome to really be involving a lot of kind of empathetic identification with the captors. And I'm wondering if that really applies to your case, or if you could give, you've mentioned briefly a kind of intimacy with the captors. So if you could go a little more into this relationship, because it wasn't clear to me. Also the implications in terms of the possibilities for resistance. And it seems that in the initial period of the crisis, we at least got a lot of news about resistance, whereas from what you're telling us, it seems that this is more of now an experience of resignation. So how is the relationship with the crypto-colonial occupiers getting played out in terms of identification or not? Thank you.
Daniel, maybe I'll answer first, since you have a
Yes.
longer answer
Please.
to give. Dorothy, maybe could you just clarify what you mean by the temporality of doing our ethnographic work?
Yeah, the fact that you've been able to observe this place over a long-term period, and knowing people and observing their lives and being close to them over a long-term period.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's given you an especially privileged position, or if you had just gone in and explored it? Starting now and retrospectively on their experiences, what kind of difference would that make?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, like you, I've been doing research on Cyprus for about 30 years. So certainly I have seen a whole host of changes over that period of time. And what has been interesting is that, I mean, as you would expect, of course, a lot of the ethnographic insights that I have now had to emerge out of changes that I saw over that period of time. Mm-hmm. In other words, for example, when certain things change, but people talk as though they remain the same, right? Then you have to think about, well, what's going on there? Or simply observing over several decades, you know, how people have been actually physically affected health-wise by a state of chronic uncertainty. Wow. Yeah, the high numbers of sudden deaths and things like this that occur. So there's, of course, there's unfortunately not been much study about this, but my sense is that there is a connection to be made between certain kinds of physical responses to this uncertainty, or rather, I mean, I think there's a connection that we can make between the uncertainty and these kinds of responses that many people have had. So things of this sort. I mean, certainly it would have been very difficult to see these things or to understand them if I hadn't been working on this for such a very long time. But I'm not sure if you wanted to know something else.
This is, I mean, it's no, thank you. It confirms also the value of this kind of deep engagement over a long-term period on the part of ethnographers.
Daniel?
Daniel, you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing, I agree with you with South Italy as well. I've spent quite a lot of time down there myself the last 20 years or so, and can see how this can relate, particularly in terms of the idea of colonialism from within and such like. But that's a conversation for another time. The temporality of my ethnographic work. So when I first went to do my research as a PhD student, it was obviously before the economic crisis struck Greece. And I went to do a reassessment of John Campbell's famous work on patronage and clientelism, and how small and medium businesses were negotiating, on the one hand, these quite neoliberal or modes of economics, and holding in the same time these more, let's say, traditional cultural ways of doing economics, such as patronage and clientelism. And whilst I was there, the economic crisis struck. And that was where you sort of made the decision of, do I continue with a normal project, or is this already history? Is this already in the past? Do I have to be a good anthropologist and follow my research participants whose narratives had changed almost overnight with this very much a rupture of crisis? And from there, as this sort of crisis, you're quite perhaps linking to your second question as well about how at the start it was seen as a rupture. You saw a lot of sort of protest and resistance, and that's perhaps not so much the case now. But anyway, over the course of the next decade, 15 years, this is what the new book is really about, is how a crisis as rupture has different teleoaffects, both collectively and sort of on the individual and the relationship to the self and family, when it hits at that moment, or at that point where it looks like it's going to be something temporary, where there is this idea that it will be overcome and that it will blow over. I mean, crisis, like in South Italy, crisis in Greece wasn't something which was completely unfamiliar. There was always the latest thriller on television. There was always the latest crisis. And this at the beginning was just the next one, and it wasn't really given much attention. But then as the years went on, of course, it became an axiomatic, or it became a sense of permanence. And in that new book, it is saying, well, how do people then experience time, experience the future, and this relationship to others and themselves when it becomes a chronic state? In terms of Stockholm Syndrome, yeah, I know I'm opening myself up to a critique of using a term which could be seen as pathologizing, but I do repeat that it's part of the local vernacular for dealing with it, and I'm trying to use it in a sociological sense, and I'll be happy to defend that. So yeah, there is a degree of empathy, and I'm sure some people will disagree with me, and I'm sure some people in the room may disagree with me, that there is an empathy towards not only sort of we deserve this as such, but an understanding of why these types of structural reforms had to happen in hindsight. Also that comparatively speaking, there's an understanding of why it had to happen, the sort of Greece's place in the world, Greece's place in the sort of more sort of collective sense of economy and politics in Europe. The empathy to do with the captors, you would think, looking at a lot of the literature on Greece, was at odds with this resistance and protest that we saw on our television screens. There's two things I'd like to say to that. First of all, I am working in the rural central agricultural plains, where there never was protests, there never was Molotov cocktails, there never were people mass protesting this. There was the sense that life had to go on as best as it possibly could. There were certain programs that were put there, which we didn't see in other parts of Greece, diversification programs for farmers towards renewable energy technologies, for example. But there wasn't the general sense, there wasn't the visible sense of protest and resistance. Food banks and things like that were very rare in the region as well. And also this was very much at the start, even within Greece, it was more so at the start of the economic crisis in the urban centres, at the point of crisis being rupture. As it became a chronic condition, it's died down across the country. That's not to say there aren't. Of course, there's solidarity movements, there's still protest groups, there's still activists working away. But it has become, for the people that I worked with, at least, less and less a part of their social reality, and more of an idea if we have to cope and do the best we can in this life. Now, looking back historically, even back to the Civil War years of the 1940s, when it was all the history books are left against right, all the sort of oral histories about it have narratives of this extreme conflict. The narratives that I've taken on this for my first book, History, Time and Economic Crisis in Central Greece, were more so from people who wanted to get on with their lives. There was not great political divides in a lot of these families, and that's the bits which are often silenced and left out of history. It's the things which are not the events, they're not the eventedness there. It's people trying to make the most out of their everyday lives, which also, I suppose, speaks to your first point of how important it is to do these long-term pieces of field work, to capture not only the event, not only the big sort of ruptures and the things which make the headlines, but also the everyday rhythms and tempos of people just wanting to get on and live their lives.
Okay, thank you.
Il tuo audio, ok, adesso vuoi parlare.
Luigi Lombardi Satriani. Ciao Luigi, se vuoi puoi parlare. Daniel e Rebecca, if you need a translation, we will help.
Grazie Dorothy.
Prego.
Bene hanno fatto le colleghe all'inizio delle riunioni a richiamare la condizione di pandemia che ci affligge e che incombe sul nostro tempo. Ora è diventato un luogo comune ormai l'idea che da questa pandemia avremo risposti positivi. Alla fine avremo una nuova visione, quasi una nuova mentalità, in qualche maniera una nuova maniera di organizzare le nostre relazioni. Io non ne usciremo ma più maturi. Io non sono personalmente d'accordo con questa visione che trovo inutilmente trionfalistica. La storia ci ha mostrato adeguatamente come le grandi tragedie epidemiche o di guerra hanno educato le società che le hanno pedite, non le hanno educate, cioè, tutti socialmente non elaborati, ma piuttosto rimossi, rispecchianti le esigenze peculiarmente umane di accantonamento, di accantonare le esperienze drammatiche. Questa è una caratteristica che segna anche della salvifica leggerezza dell'animo umano di fronte a queste tragedie del passato, alle influenze del negativo, nell'esperienza di una pandemia che gli eventi plasmano anche i corpi. Lo sappiamo bene sin dai tempi di Marcel Mauss, costruzioni culturali che variano a seconda delle epoche e delle circostanze, laddove la pandemia non ha condotto tragicamente alla morte nella maggioranza dei casi, ha portato ad un progressivo isolamento. Questo ha sicuramente modificato i nostri corpi e la rete relazionale che noi intrattenevamo con altri corpi e con tutti i loro contesti. Il febbraio 2020 ha segnato, lo sappiamo bene, la nascita ufficiale della pandemia da Covid-19, dalla quale stiamo forse faticosamente uscendo, anche se molto dipenderà da come noi stessi ci comporteremo. Nel periodo appena trascorso abbiamo conosciuto in forma altamente e altalenante momenti di paura, di sconforto, di resilienza, di speranza, con enormi perdite, ed è giusto sempre ricordare noi superstiti quanti non ce l'hanno fatto. Abbiamo comunque riscoperto alcune certezze che potrebbero esserci utili per un'effettiva nuova partenza. Abbiamo scoperto la nostra fragilità, la nostra paura dell'isolamento, che è cosa diversa dalla solitudine, che può essere anche voluta come un momento di pausa, di concentrazione. Per cui noi sappiamo che l'io è insufficiente se non c'è un tu al quale rapportarsi per trascendersi. Lui nel comunitario noi che rifonda la società costituendosi come comunità. Una vastissima letteratura scientifica, socio-antropologica, da Max Weber sia ai nostri contemporanei, ha affrontato questi temi, dilatando così la nostra consapevolezza critica. Riscopriamo che alcuni valori che avevamo troppo faticosamente, obbligativamente accantonato sono obsoleto come appaiono, sono in realtà fondanti la civiltà occidentale e non solo essa, la generosità, la solidarietà con l'altro, l'identità che si riporta all'alterità come suo indispensabile correlato dialettico e così via. In questa prospettiva potremmo scoprire la sempiterna validità di cuore e dei momenti narrativi di meccanismi narrativi di mix, sui quali acutamente si sofferma recentemente Marcello Fois nel suo Invenzione degli italiani, dove ti porta fuori. Siamo anche, dopo tanto doloroso isolamento, il bisogno di abbracciarsi, di abbracciare l'altro, iniziando con lui l'ascesa alla vita che riprende, divenendo gioia sino alla libertà, danza dell'insopprimibile volontà di vita che rinasce dalle macerie, scopre le radici che compongono il cemento.
Scusa, Luigi, possiamo tradurre?
Io
Devono tradurre.
finisco.
Ok.
Per quanto riguarda l'antropologia in particolare, credo che si possa essere fiduciosi. Essa certamente avrà ancora un ruolo cardine nel futuro, in quanto costituisce pur sempre un discorso sulla cultura, il senso universale nello spazio e nel tempo. A suo modo, dunque, antropologia del futuro e anche futuro dell'antropologia, e questo garantisce una qualche sua immortalità sin quando il sole risplende sulle sciagure umane. Grazie per l'attenzione.
Would you follow a bit or you want me to translate?
Daniel King, è un vero piacere averla.
I think it's best we have a short translation of the core point, please.
È un grande onore ascoltarli.
Sorry?
20 anni fa
Chiudi.
vissuto a lungo con i suoi libri. Mia moglie è un'antropologa che lavora in Calabria. Il suo nome e i suoi lavori sono stati parte della sua vita e anche della mia per molti anni. Grazie Daniel, metto, eh.
Okay, I was just saying that Luigi Lombardi Satriani has been part of our lives in my house for the last 20 years. His books and his name has, from my partner's doctoral research in Calabria to my life just a few days ago, talking about him and his work over dinner. So it was a great honor for me to have his thoughts and questions there at the end of our talk. But I think it would be best for the core points, because my following of Italian is very, very basic. So I think it would be best for his core points to be summarized in English, and we'll do our best to respond to those.
It is not very easy to summarize, but I will try. He was saying that he was speaking about the pandemic and our experience in the pandemic. He said that he do not agree with whom is saying that we will come out from the pandemic more mature, better, because wars and tragedy did not make societies better than they were before. But we discover again some our fears, our fragilities, and we discover again that the I, the self, is not sufficient if there is no you and if there is no us, that only us can reform the society. And finally also say that he trusts in anthropology, in the future of anthropology in this new situation. I hope I try to. Then maybe Luigi will send us his speech because he has written it. So thank you. Now we have Justine. I think she wrote a question on the chat. I don't know whether if you saw it. Rimetti la domanda. Justine, you can talk.
Thank you.
Okay.
Grazie a tutti. In speaking of the future, I have a methodological question for you both. As an early career researcher, I'm looking into conducting research, and I wanted to know how conducting research in times of crisis, how I can think about navigating this, or if either of you have been conducting research in the field during this time. Yes, I've also written a version of it in the chat, so I'm kind of nervous. But what does conducting research in times of crisis or precarity, what are the difficulties or maybe benefits of that you have experienced or that you could advise on? Thank you. Grazie.
Okay. Thanks for that question, Justine, and thank you to Professor Lombardi Satriani for his comments. And I didn't understand any of them. I only understood the translation or the summary of them. But yes, I think that your comments that we will not come out of this more mature or better is likely a true one. And I'm glad that you have faith in anthropology. I think I do think that it can provide us with certain tools. So perhaps it will help us in this condition. I have been conducting field work during this period, Justine, and that's because, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, at the start of the shutdown in March 2020, I was in North Cyprus, and I had to make a split-second decision to leave or stay, and I stayed. And so I spent the whole lockdown period and really almost the entire period up until about a month ago there. And it's, I mean, Daniel can say it's more about crisis per se. This particular crisis, a health crisis, pandemic, you know, is quite different in terms of fieldwork. And I also am the coordinator of a 2-year research master's program where ordinarily we send students to the field for 6 months. So we've been dealing with the problems that are entailed by that. And so there are a few things. One is, I think that it is possible to do research during this period, but because, as we know, everything is in a sort of up and down state. I mean, a kind of roller coaster where things will close and then open and close and then open. And maybe we're getting past that. Maybe there will be no big closures anymore. It's not clear. But because of that, I think that long-term fieldwork is especially important, because you may have periods when you can't talk to people, when you can't see them face to face. Some of our students found that by going to the places where they wanted to do fieldwork at a time of opening, even if they could only meet with the people that they wanted to meet for, let's say, a month, and then everything shut down again and they had to do research online, at least they had that contact. And they found that helped them quite a lot. So I think that we are in a position as anthropologists where, for at least the next few years, and who knows for how long, much longer, we're going to have to think about and doing field work in in a more, I don't know, improvisatory way, and also how to incorporate online ethnography more centrally into our work, but also, you know, recognizing that can't be everything. And so how do we then, you know, find ways to interact with people, of course, while keeping everyone safe? You know, so this is, you know, that's one of the big differences, I think, from other forms of crisis, the fact that we have to take into account everyone's safety. You know. Daniel, I don't know if you want to say anything about your experience in, during the financial crisis. Or I guess I know that you weren't doing research in person, at least, during this period.
Yeah, sure. So first, to Professor Luigi Lombardi-Satriani, I'd also like to say thank you, and say that it's incredible the way that anthropologists always seem to be talking about suffering and crisis. It seems to be our meat and drink of our research. If something bad happens, it makes a good ethnography, which obviously is ethically and has ethical implications and makes us look at things in a certain light. So an anthropology of war, tragedy, crisis and such like does emphasize the need for more than the individual. And I think we were getting at that when we were talking about the state and the state's role in the future and the expectation of futures that are built into the idea of sovereignty and a collective momentum towards the future that is the state, or at least imagined to be the state. And that's where I think we could say more about Scotland in that as well. And that is a very good question at the end, really, is what can anthropology contribute to this? What can anthropologists contribute to the idea of recovery or to a positive anticipation of the future, if anything? So moving to the Justine's question about fieldwork, well, I was quite the opposite from Rebecca. I hadn't left the 2 or 3 streets that is St. Andrews, which is a tiny village. Well, we had about 8,000 people here during the lockdown. Our students left, 18,000 people became 8,000 people, and I never went further than the supermarket at the end of the road. for 18 months. And that obviously was not a good place to be for research. However, I would say that it wasn't, for our students at least, for our students, it wasn't unprecedented before the crisis before the lockdowns, to do alternative forms of research, to do mixed method forms of research. That's not necessarily to say that it's ideal to work remotely, or to work in social media, or to work in many other forms of mixed media to collect data. But it became necessary for so many of us, and particularly with the British constraints they have on conducting in-person research, which is nothing to do with the anthropology school. These come first of all from the university level, and then to the level of the state itself, that actually stops us from doing classic participant observation or face-to-face interviewing even. So it was a time where I think a lot of our students were more prepared than what I was to do this, having been sort of trained and brought up with a classic idea of what anthropology is and the methodologies we use. But it does go back again to Professor Zinn's question about the temporalities of fieldwork and what you can get out of a doctoral thesis compared to what you can get to an undergraduate dissertation, where you're only doing 1 or 2 months of research and you're constrained to that, to how it feels to be in the field for 10, 20, 30 years. And the different types of temporalities of our own research obviously feed into the type of argumentations that we can make, the type of representations of how these individual stories relate to a sort of a collective being, both in space and in time. So now I don't know what it's like where you are, but we are opening up and our students are able to now return to their fields under strict conditions. But I think in the long term, perhaps this is something that's good that's come out of it. The mixed methods approach, the ingenuity of students and indeed of anthropologists and researchers to combine the traditional methods with other forms of collecting data can only be positive for the sort of long-term implications of these types of things on research. There's been a lot learned from all of us, and people like myself who haven't been used to this have also been forced into the future, if you like, to think of other ways. I haven't been to Greece for over 2 years to do this, hopefully going in November. But I'd like to hear it also from the students' perspective, if perhaps in a longer conversation from your perspective, what you're envisaging and how this has affected your perspective on not only anthropological research, but what anthropology can offer as a discipline itself to this situation.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I think it's quite late and non si sente? Scusate. So I think it's quite late, so we should stop here. So I thank you, both of you, again, very, very much for this opening of our conference. I hope the conference will be fruitful for everybody. So see you tomorrow for one who will be here or online. See you tomorrow for the real opening of the panel. So thank you again, Rebecca and Daniel, and grazie a tutti. Ci vediamo domani per l'inizio della conferenza. Grazie.
Thank you from us as well. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for your questions. Thank you very much.
Grazie.